1944. Somewhere in the heart of the American Midwest, the air was still, calm, heavy with the scent of pine and freshly baked bread drifting from the camp kitchen. Beyond the barbed wire fences, the world was still at war. But inside these quiet wooden barracks, something extraordinary was about to happen. A group of weary Italian women, prisoners of war captured in North Africa and shipped across the Atlantic, shuffled hesitantly through the mess hall doors. Their uniforms were worn, their eyes hollow from months of hardship. They expected rations. Thin soup, stale bread, the same grim fare they had endured through the war. But what awaited them instead was abundance. Steam rose from metal trays stacked with meatloaf, mashed potatoes glistening with butter, loaves of white bread, bowls of fresh fruit, oranges, apples, even bananas. The women froze, confused, their gazes darting from one dish to the next. Was this a trick, a dream? In Italy, even civilians were surviving on meager scraps. Yet here, in a camp meant for prisoners, stood a buffet that seemed fit for royalty. A single question rippled through the crowd, whispered in disbelief, half in laughter, half in tears. They call this lunch. For a moment, the war outside seemed to fade. The clang of cutlery and soft murmurs replaced the echoes of gunfire. For the first time in months, these women felt human again. This was not the victory they imagined, but it was mercy in its simplest, most human form. The story of those women did not begin with abundance. It began with surrender. It began with silence, dust, and the dull echo of boots on sand in a place where the sun itself seemed to burn the horizon into gold and ash. North Africa, 1943. The war had turned against the Axis. The once proud Italian empire that Mussolini had promised would rule the Mediterranean was collapsing like dry clay. What remained of its expeditionary forces? Soldiers, nurses, mechanics, drivers, and administrators were now prisoners of war. Among them were women, Italian auxiliaries, members of the Servizio Ausiliario Femminile, some barely in their 20s. They had followed the army into Tunisia and Libya, serving in hospitals and field kitchens, carrying supplies, tending to the wounded. But when the Allied troops advanced, their world crumbled overnight. When the orders came to surrender, they were told not to fear. The Americans are not like the others. One officer muttered, perhaps to comfort them, or himself. The women, exhausted and covered in sand, clutched small bags of belongings, a photo of a family left behind in Sicily or Naples, a letter never sent. They were marched toward waiting trucks, unsure of what awaited them. To them, captivity meant humiliation. Stories had circulated of what Germans had done to prisoners, of hunger, of cruelty. They expected to vanish into some foreign camp where no one would remember their names. But when they reached the Allied holding station, the first thing they saw was order. Rows of tents, white and clean, water tanks gleaming in the sun, soldiers directing movements with calm gestures instead of shouts. It was the first crack in the image of the enemy they had been taught to despise. The journey that followed was long, longer than they ever imagined. From desert to port, through nights spent under the open sky, the women were moved from one temporary camp to another. Each stage stripped away another piece of their old lives. Uniforms were checked, documents taken, identification recorded. They were no longer nurses or clerks. They were numbers on lists. One morning, they were told they would be transferred overseas. No one explained where. Rumors spread. Some whispered that they were being sent to England, others that they'd become laborers somewhere in Africa. But when they reached the docks, their breath caught in their throats. Before them loomed massive ships, grey, towering, the likes of which they had only seen in propaganda posters. American transport vessels, the sound of cranes and chains filled the air. Allied soldiers shouted in English, a language most of the women did not understand. But its rhythm was strangely calm compared to the frantic bark of German orders they had known in Africa. They boarded in silence. The ship's steel decks were hot underfoot. Inside, the air smelled of oil and salt water. They were herded below deck into large, open compartments, cramped but organized. Straw mattresses lined the walls, barrels of water stood in the corners, and overhead, a single bulb flickered in the swaying dark. The door shut, sealing them into a humming world of steel and waves. The voyage across the Atlantic was not kind. The sea was restless that month. Waves slammed against the hull, and the ship groaned like a living creature. Many fell seasick, clutching buckets as the room rolled endlessly from side to side. Some prayed softly in Italian, Santa Maria, protegesi, while others sat motionless, their eyes fixed on the metal floor. Days bled into nights. There was no sky, no horizon, only the steady thrum of engines and the distant call of guards above deck. Food came in tin bowls, rice, bread, sometimes beans. It was bland but enough to keep them alive. Yet even then, even in that floating cage, the treatment was not cruel. American medics occasionally checked on them, offering medicine to those who were too sick to stand. It was not kindness, perhaps, just procedure, but to the women it felt like mercy. After 2 weeks the ocean began to change. The air grew colder, the waves calmer. Then one morning, a sound broke through the usual monotony, a distant foghorn. The women pressed to the portholes, squinting through the mist. And there, through the pale veil of dawn, they saw it, land. Not Africa, not Europe, but a vast foreign coastline. The United States of America. The ship approached a military dock bustling with trucks, cranes, and men in khaki uniforms. Bands of sunlight danced on the water. The women were lined up, counted again, and guided down the gangway. Some stumbled, weak from the journey. A few wept silently as they stepped onto the wooden pier. They had crossed the world as prisoners, and now stood in a land they had once known only through maps and propaganda. Everything was unfamiliar. The language, the faces, the sheer scale of everything. Even the air smelled different, crisp, with the faint scent of pine and diesel. They were loaded onto trains, their destination still a mystery. The trip inland took days. Out the windows, they watched a new world rush past. Endless green fields, neat towns, white houses with porches and waving children. No ruins, no rubble, no warplanes overhead. It felt unreal, as if they had stepped into another century. Eventually the train slowed. The landscape turned rural, wide plains, wooden fences and distant barns. When the train finally stopped, guards directed them toward a long dirt road leading to what appeared to be a camp. Not a prison, not the dark fortress they expected, but a tidy settlement of wooden barracks surrounded by wire fences. The sign on the gate was written in English. They couldn't read it, but the guards smiled politely and waved them forward. Inside, they were assigned quarters. Long rooms lined with bunk beds, each with clean sheets and a small locker. The air was warm, the light soft. On the wall hung a simple sign, Mess Hall, noon. That night, as the sun dipped behind the trees, the camp fell into silence. The women lay awake on their bunks, staring at the wooden ceiling. Somewhere nearby, they could hear laughter. American soldiers chatting in low tones, maybe sharing stories of home. A faint tune drifted through the night, a harmonica playing what sounded like a folk song. It was not what they had imagined. No screams, no chains, no hunger, only routine, structure, and the hum of life continuing in a world that had chosen not to hate them. One woman, Lucia, clutched her rosary and whispered a prayer. She had joined the auxiliary believing she was serving her country. Now she wondered what that truly meant. Another, Maria, closed her eyes and thought of her mother in Rome, wondering if she was still alive. Others simply stared out the small window, watching the moonlight glint off the barbed wire. Outside, the American flag fluttered in the night breeze, the symbol of their captors. But to these women, it now represented something unexpected: stability. Days turned into a quiet rhythm. Morning roll call, work assignments, and, surprisingly, moments of peace. They were allowed to write letters, though censored, and some were given small jobs: laundry, kitchen assistance, tending gardens. Each task, though simple, gave them a sense of normalcy. The Americans watched them cautiously but not cruelly. They were prisoners, yes, but not enemies to be broken. The guards' demeanor was firm but measured, often tinged with curiosity. Many of these young American men had never seen Italian women before. And despite the walls that separated them, there was a strange mutual respect in the air. The quiet recognition that both sides had lost too much already. At dusk, the camp would glow with lamplight. The hum of generators mixed with the chirping of crickets. And from the kitchen, the smell of coffee, strong, bitter, unmistakably American, would drift through the camp. That smell lingered in the memory of those women for decades, because it wasn't just coffee. It was the scent of a world that had not collapsed, a world that still had order, warmth, and abundance, things that had vanished in war-torn Italy. For the first time since their capture, they felt the faint stirrings of something long-forgotten safety. It was fragile, yes, temporary, but real. And in that quiet camp, far from home, they began to understand that captivity could look very different depending on who held the keys. The war outside raged on, but within those wooden fences, another kind of story was unfolding. One not of hatred or punishment, but of discovery. The women had been captured as enemies, yet what they found here was a glimpse of humanity the battlefield had erased. In the following days, they would learn routines, meet guards who treated them with civility, and adapt to a strange rhythm of life in captivity. But the true shock, the moment that would live in their memories for the rest of their lives, had not yet come. That moment would arrive soon, with the ringing of a lunch bell. But for now they slept, under a foreign flag, on clean sheets, in a world that smelled faintly of soap and pine, unaware that the next morning would forever redefine what enemy and mercy meant. The morning began like any other in the camp. The sun rose slowly over the horizon, painting the sky in muted shades of pink and gold. Birds sang from the treetops, their chirps carried over the open fields and through the barbed wire that enclosed the camp. The air was crisp and cool, carrying the faint aroma of freshly dug earth from the gardens tended by prisoners and guards alike. In the wooden barracks, the Italian women stirred, brushing the sleep from their eyes, their minds already half consumed by curiosity and apprehension. Today, like every day, they would eat, but they did not know that this meal would change everything. The bell rang sharply, echoing across the camp, a sound they had grown accustomed to but never quite mastered. They lined up quietly, trays in hand, their movements slow and deliberate. Many whispered to one another in low Italian, sharing their own fears and speculations. What would they be served? A thin soup, the meager rations they had come to expect, stale bread and hard biscuits. The whispers grew louder as they approached the mess hall, a wooden structure with wide doors that swung open to reveal a scene none could have imagined. The room was filled with the smell of warmth, butter, roasted meats, and baking bread. Metal trays gleamed under the soft light, stacked neatly in rows, as if each had been placed with painstaking care. Bowls of steaming mashed potatoes glistened with butter, bright green vegetables steamed gently, and golden brown chicken rested beside slices of warm bread. Even dessert, something they had almost forgotten existed, was present: pies, cakes, and fruit topped with whipped cream. The women froze. The hum of the camp faded into the background. All they could do was stare, their eyes wide with disbelief. Maria, a nurse of 22, blinked several times. She raised her tray, unsure if she had understood correctly. This is for us," she whispered. Lucia, her friend and companion on this long journey, let out a quiet laugh that trembled on the edge of disbelief. Many of the women murmured among themselves, some shaking their heads, others wiping tears that had begun to form. To be served such a meal, abundance on a scale they had never imagined, felt surreal. In their minds, the words echoed. They called this lunch. Some were hesitant to approach the trays. After months of war, hunger, and fear, abundance was foreign. The idea of taking more than a small portion seemed almost sinful. Many glanced at their companions, seeking permission, reassurance. The cooks, young American men and women, smiled gently, offering portions freely, explaining in broken Italian what each dish contained. Their hands were steady, their demeanor calm, almost tender. No one pushed, no one scolded. It was generosity in its purest form, presented without expectation. The women began to serve themselves slowly, carefully. Their hands trembled as they lifted spoonsful of mashed potatoes, slices of chicken, and bowls of vegetables. The texture, the color, the smell, every sense was overwhelmed. For some, it was too much. They sat at the long tables in silence, staring at the food as if it might vanish if they looked away. Others began to speak, soft laughter breaking the tension, a sound that had been all but extinguished in their lives over the past year. As they tasted the food, shock gave way to relief. The chicken was tender, the potatoes creamy, the vegetables perfectly seasoned. Even the bread, fresh and warm, seemed miraculous. A few of the women wept quietly, tears of gratitude and disbelief mingling with the laughter that now filled the room. It was a sensory awakening, a reminder of the humanity they had been denied for so long. Hunger had not only gnawed at their bodies, but at their spirits. This meal fed both. The atmosphere in the mess hall began to transform. The clatter of trays and the murmur of voices created a rhythm, almost musical in its cadence. Guards and cooks moved among the tables, offering more food, smiling at the reactions. The women, once timid and cautious, began to relax, to converse, to share bites of fruit and bread with one another. They told stories of home, of families, of friends lost or missing. Each mouthful of food became a bridge between memory and present, between fear and hope. Outside, the camp hummed with life. Other prisoners moved along the paths between barracks, carrying their trays, talking softly. The sun poured through the windows of the mess hall, illuminating the steam rising from the food, casting long shadows across the wooden floor. For the first time in months, the Italian women felt a sense of normalcy, a fleeting but precious illusion of home. The walls that confined them no longer seemed so oppressive. They were merely boundaries within which life could continue, even flourish. This meal became a ritual, a turning point. It was no longer just nourishment. It was a statement, a subtle lesson in mercy and dignity. The American army had shown that even in times of war, humanity could persist. The food on their plates was not merely sustenance. It was a symbol. It said, without words, that these women were not enemies to be broken, but human beings deserving care. The simple act of serving food with thought and attention became revolutionary. Over the next days and weeks, the women would reflect on this first meal countless times. They would remember the color of the vegetables, the warmth of the bread in their hands, the tenderness of the meat. They would recall the smiles of the cooks, the way sunlight danced across the mess hall tables, the quiet dignity of the orderly lines in which they had stood. It was a memory that would survive decades, a constant reminder that even amidst global conflict, kindness could emerge in the smallest, most ordinary acts. They began to anticipate meals with a strange mixture of excitement and disbelief. They began to notice subtleties, the careful seasoning, the clean utensils, the orderliness of the dining area. They realized that this was not luck or happenstance. It was intention. The Americans had created a space in which captives could reclaim a fragment of their humanity. A simple lunch shared without fear or judgment became a quiet rebellion against the harshness of war. Even those who were most skeptical began to embrace it. At first, small smiles, subtle glances of approval. Then laughter, quiet conversations, and even singing in low tones. The act of eating together, with no coercion and no threat, transformed the camp into something unfamiliar. Not a prison, but a temporary sanctuary. Through food, boundaries softened, and trust began to form, however tentatively. By the end of that first meal, the women had experienced something extraordinary. Their bodies were nourished, yes, but more importantly, their spirits were replenished. They had been reminded that even in the darkest of times, abundance and care were possible. They understood, without needing to articulate it, that war did not strip the world of all beauty. Mercy could exist even within the confines of captivity. Compassion could be administered not with speeches or laws, but with something as simple and elemental as a meal. And when the last bite was taken, when the trays were emptied, and the steam vanished into the sunlit air, the women looked at one another, a mixture of wonder and disbelief in their eyes. No one spoke immediately. Words seemed insufficient. Instead, they smiled, a fragile, tentative smile, as if testing the reality of what had just occurred. For many, it was the first time in months that they felt seen, acknowledged, and in some small way cherished. From that moment onward, mealtime became the heartbeat of the camp. Each meal a ritual, each tray a promise that humanity could endure, even in the face of war. And though the war raged on outside the fences, for those Italian women, a single lunch had already rewritten their understanding of enemy and ally, of fear and kindness, of survival and mercy. Life inside the camp settled into a rhythm, slow and deliberate, a cadence that seemed impossible in a world consumed by war. For the Italian women, the days stretched long but predictable, each marked by routine tasks and the small rituals that made captivity bearable. Yet even in the quiet predictability, there was an undercurrent of revelation. They had expected suffering, deprivation, and cruelty. Instead, they found structure, order, and something entirely foreign: mercy. The concept of mercy, abstract in theory, had never before been experienced so tangibly. In this camp it had a smell, a texture, a taste. It was in the food, the words, the gestures of those who guarded and guided them. The perimeter fences, though tall and formidable, did not feel threatening. The barbed wire, the watchtowers, and the armed sentries reminded them constantly that they were prisoners. Yet within the confines, there was a strange softness, a humanity that pervaded every interaction. The guards, young men barely older than the prisoners themselves, moved with a mixture of authority and consideration. They spoke little, but when they did, it was polite, measured, never cruel. Some offered advice about daily routines, some helped carry baskets of vegetables from the camp gardens. Their presence, once a symbol of confinement, gradually became a source of reassurance, a reminder that order could coexist with care. The women were given tasks within the camp, small duties that imparted both responsibility and a sense of purpose. They tended gardens planted with carrots, beans, and leafy greens. Each seed they planted became a quiet defiance against the war, a fragile act of creation in a world dominated by destruction. Some were assigned to the kitchen, learning to assist the cooks in preparation, observing the meticulous care with which each tray was prepared. Others helped with laundry or cleaning, discovering that even simple labor could be meditative when approached with thoughtfulness. These routines, repeated day after day, became the scaffolding of normal life, a fragile reconstruction of the world they had known before the war. Language became a bridge between worlds. The Italian women began to learn snippets of English from the American guards and cooks, just as the Americans learned Italian words in return. Greetings, pleasantries, small exchanges of humor. These were minor, almost trivial interactions, yet they carried tremendous weight. Every correctly spoken word, every mutual smile, became proof that human connection could exist even in the most unlikely circumstances. Letters, too, provided another layer of communication. Though censored and slow, they allowed the women to reach out to their families, to preserve a sense of identity and continuity with the lives they had left behind. Meals, already extraordinary, became the heartbeat of camp life. The routine of lining up, receiving trays, and sharing the space at long wooden tables created a rhythm that punctuated each day. These meals were more than sustenance, they were lessons in dignity. Watching the careful distribution of food, the Americans' patience, the orderliness of the process, the Italian women understood that this was intentional. Mercy was not delivered in grand speeches or proclamations. It was given quietly, thoughtfully, with a single-minded attention to the well-being of others. A plate of food, served with consideration and respect, became a manifesto of humanity in a world that had all but forgotten such gestures. Beyond the mess hall, the camp offered moments of quiet reflection. Paths wound between barracks, shaded by tall trees that whispered in the wind. Small gardens flourished in the sunlight, tended equally by guards and prisoners. Laundry lines swayed with the breeze, the garments themselves a patchwork of forwardness and familiarity. The women would walk these paths during free time, pausing to watch birds flit between branches or to greet guards with a shy smile. These moments, mundane to outsiders, were revolutionary in their simplicity. In a war defined by cruelty, routine, and fear, they discovered that life could be gentle, deliberate, and considerate. The concept of mercy extended beyond food and labor. When illness struck, the American medics attended to the women promptly, with calm professionalism. No complaint, no lecture, only care. Fevers were reduced, wounds treated, and the sick were nurtured back to health. Even the smallest acts, like offering an extra blanket or a warm cup of tea, communicated the same message here. Within the fences, compassion mattered. In a war where so much had been taken from them, family, home, certainty, these small gestures rebuilt a sense of trust and belonging. Friendships began to form, delicate and tentative, yet remarkably resilient. The women supported one another through homesickness, anxiety, and the lingering trauma of war. Shared meals, shared tasks, and shared laughter became the fabric of their days. They would compare letters from home, swap stories of past lives, and whisper hopes for the future. Within the camp, a small community emerged, bound not by freedom, but by resilience and the recognition of shared humanity. The fences that confined them could not contain the bonds they formed. The barbed wire could not restrain the quiet defiance of connection. Even the guards became participants in this fragile microcosm of humanity. Occasionally, a young soldier would pause to watch the women planting in the garden, offering advice or encouragement. Others would lend a hand, carrying a basket of vegetables or helping to mend a fence. These interactions, fleeting and simple, blurred the lines of enmity. The women began to perceive the guards not merely as jailers, but as individuals capable of kindness and understanding. Caught in circumstances not entirely of their own making, they learned that mercy, like food, could be distributed freely, without expectation, and that even within the machinery of war, small acts of compassion could have immeasurable impact. Music, too, found its place in the camp. At quiet times, someone would hum a tune while working, another would accompany them with a soft tap of a hand or a whispered rhythm. Songs from Italy mingled with the faint strains of American folk melodies, creating a soundscape that was neither foreign nor familiar, but entirely new. In these moments, prisoners and guards alike shared in something beyond survival, a shared appreciation of beauty. A fleeting yet profound connection that transcended borders, languages, and allegiances. Through these experiences, the Italian women came to understand the subtle power of mercy. It was not granted as a reward, nor wielded as a tool of control. It was simply present, integrated into daily life. It existed in the way food was prepared and served, in the way gardens were tended, in the attentiveness of medical care, in the quiet, measured actions of those who had authority over them. They began to see mercy not as weakness, but as strength, a quiet force that could sustain life, nurture hope, and preserve dignity even in the shadow of conflict. Over time, the camp itself transformed in their eyes. What had once seemed confining and foreign now felt structured, safe, and in its own way human. The wooden barracks, the fences, the watchtowers, symbols of captivity, were softened by the routines and rituals of care. The long tables in the mess hall became a place of connection rather than mere sustenance. The gardens were not just plots of soil, but living symbols of growth and resilience. The fences did not merely separate, they framed a space in which compassion could take root. Letters home became a repository of this discovery. In the careful lines of ink on paper, the women described meals, gardens, small kindnesses, and quiet conversations. They wrote of guards who smiled, of medics who tended wounds with patience, of meals that nourished not only the body, but the spirit. And though the censors would trim their words, the essence remained. Even in captivity, humanity endured. In the evenings, the women would gather quietly in small groups, reflecting on the day. They would speak of meals shared, laughter discovered, and the surprising warmth of the guards. Some prayed, some sang, others simply sat in silence, contemplating the small miracles of daily life. In these moments, the distinction between enemy and friend blurred. They began to understand that war had not defined the boundaries of kindness. People had. And in this camp, behind barbed wire and watchtowers, people had chosen mercy. It was not perfect. There were strict rules, times of discipline, and moments of frustration. Yet these did not overshadow the prevailing reality. The women had found a space in which life could be lived with dignity, where small acts of humanity became a powerful counterpoint to the destruction beyond the fences. In learning to navigate this environment, they learned to trust, to hope, and to recognize that mercy could be cultivated, nurtured, and shared even in the harshest circumstances. As weeks passed, the Italian women grew stronger, more confident, and more resilient. The camp, once merely a site of detention, became a classroom in humanity. They learned lessons that could not be taught in textbooks, that order could exist without cruelty, that work could be meaningful without oppression, and that simple acts of kindness could resonate far beyond their immediate moment. In the garden, at the tables, along the pathways of the camp, mercy was tangible, visible, and transformative. By the end of their first month, the women had internalized a profound truth. The boundaries of captivity did not determine the capacity for compassion. Even in a camp designed to hold them as prisoners, they had found freedom in the generosity, patience, and attentiveness of those who cared for them. They had learned that humanity was not confined to one nation or one uniform, but existed wherever individuals chose to recognize the dignity of others. In time, these lessons would stay with them, shaping their understanding of people, war, and morality. They would remember the faces of the guards who treated them with respect, the hands that tended the gardens, the voices that hummed and sang, the careful preparation of each meal. They would carry the knowledge that mercy, when offered freely and without expectation, could transform even the bleakest circumstances. Even as war raged far beyond the fences, they had discovered a different kind of victory. A quiet, unspoken triumph of compassion over cruelty, of humanity over enmity. Within the wooden barracks along the sun-dappled paths, and behind the barbed wire that delineated their confinement, the Italian women learned that the simplest gestures, a meal, a smile, a kind word, could endure longer than gunfire, longer than imprisonment, and perhaps even longer than war itself. Time has a way of bending memory, stretching some moments into eternity, while allowing others to fade into near nothingness. For the Italian women who had survived captivity in the American POW camps, one day, one single lunch, refused to fade. They would recall it again and again in the decades that followed, the memory vivid and almost unreal in its abundance, its simplicity, and its profound humanity. It was not just a meal, it was a revelation. A plate of food, so ordinary to the eyes of those who served it, became a symbol of something far greater. A symbol of mercy, dignity, and the fragility of war's moral lines. The morning had been unremarkable at first. The camp lay quiet under a soft, golden sunlight. Birds sang in the trees, a gentle breeze stirred the canvas tents, and the wooden barracks stood orderly, bathed in the calm light of early day. The women, accustomed by now to the rhythm of camp life, moved toward the mess hall with trays in hand. Their steps were hesitant, but curiosity shimmered beneath their uncertainty. They had eaten in this hall many times before, and each meal had been generous, considerate, and nourishing. But today, something felt different. The air itself seemed charged, as if the camp anticipated an event that would quietly change those who passed through its doors. When the doors swung open, they were confronted with a sight that defied imagination. The long wooden tables were laden with trays, bowls, and platters, each one more abundant than the last. Steam rose from every dish, catching the morning light in ethereal clouds that hovered above the food like a promise. Chicken roasted to golden perfection, mashed potatoes glistening with butter, fresh vegetables still warm from the kitchen. Slices of bread so soft and fragrant they almost seemed unreal were stacked neatly alongside bowls of fruit, oranges, apples, and the occasional banana, a fruit they had scarcely seen outside of markets back home. And then, at the far end, a small selection of desserts, pies and cakes topped with whipped cream, beckoned quietly, inviting them to taste something that had once been a luxury in their own homes. The women froze. Silence rippled through the room, punctuated only by the soft hum of conversation between the cooks who moved gracefully from table to table, offering assistance and encouragement. The aroma alone was intoxicating, conjuring memories of home that had been buried under months of fear and deprivation. Eyes widened, hands paused mid-motion, and for a fleeting moment, they could not reconcile the reality before them with the months of hardship that had preceded this day. Maria was the first to break the spell. She let out a soft laugh, almost a whisper, that carried across the table. "They call this lunch," she murmured, disbelief thick in her voice. The words, meant as rhetorical, were met with smiles and nods from the other women. Some shook their heads, as though trying to wake themselves from a dream. Others simply stared, the muscles of their faces frozen in astonishment. They had eaten before. They had survived on food provided in the camp, and even during their long, perilous journey across the Atlantic. But never had they encountered such care, such meticulous preparation, such abundance in one sitting. The first few moments passed in hesitant awe. Hands hovered over the trays, uncertain where to begin. Many feared to take too much, worried that indulgence might be wrong, inappropriate, even selfish. The scarcity of months past had left an imprint. A belief that nothing should ever be wasted, that one should never take more than was needed. And yet, as the warmth of the food beckoned, the women began to understand that this was not scarcity disguised as generosity. This was abundance offered freely, without judgment or expectation. They moved forward cautiously, selecting slices of bread, bowls of potatoes, and portions of chicken. The texture of the bread was extraordinary, soft, warm, and fragrant, almost dissolving in the hands. The vegetables, freshly cooked and vibrant, tasted unlike anything they had eaten in months. Even the simplest bite carried a revelation that nourishment could be generous, unhurried, and imbued with care. One woman, Anna, paused mid-bite, tears forming in her eyes. It was as if the food itself carried a message that someone, somewhere, had chosen to honor their humanity, even while they remained captives. Laughter began to ripple through the room, quiet at first, then growing bolder as the women allowed themselves to relax. Some shared bites of fruit with neighbors, while others compared the texture of bread or the seasoning of vegetables. The sounds of a world they had thought lost returned. Chatter, giggles, even the occasional exclamation of delight. It was extraordinary how quickly the atmosphere shifted. A space that had once been defined by captivity now vibrated with community, camaraderie, and an almost fragile joy. The American cooks, attentive yet unobtrusive, continued their work, replenishing trays and ensuring that no one lacked. Their gestures were gentle, their smiles genuine, and their patience infinite. For the women, these small acts of attentiveness became lessons in empathy. The generosity was not loud or performative. It was quiet, steady, and deliberate, and it spoke louder than any words could have. It was a revelation that mercy did not need to be declared. It needed only to be enacted. As the meal continued, the women began to share stories. They spoke softly of towns they had known, of families left behind, of streets they had once walked and marketplaces they had visited. Every bite seemed to anchor them to the world they had lost and simultaneously bridge the distance to this new, unexpected space. Eating together, they discovered a renewed sense of identity, not as prisoners, but as human beings capable of experiencing joy, surprise, and gratitude, even amidst the shadows of war. In the weeks that followed, this lunch became legendary within the camp. It was recounted during quiet moments in the barracks, written about in letters home, and remembered long after the war had ended. To the women, it symbolized a turning point, a single moment where they recognized that even in captivity, life could be beautiful, generous, and just. They realized that their captors too could embody humanity, the lines drawn by war, between friend and enemy, captor and captive, blurred, revealing a deeper truth about the human condition. Years later, as these women reflected on that time, the memory of that lunch remained as vivid as the day it occurred. They would recall the gleam of the metal trays, the steam rising from bowls of vegetables, the golden light of the sun streaming through the windows. They remembered the trembling hands, the wide eyes, the soft laughter, and the quiet weeping that mingled together in that mess hall. Most of all, they remembered the feeling that no matter how harsh the world might be, small acts of generosity, thoughtfulness, and care could redefine existence itself. That lunch had been more than sustenance. It was a lesson in dignity, a reminder that mercy could survive in the most unlikely places, a testimony to the idea that even amidst global conflict, humanity could endure. And while the war outside the camp continued, with its destruction and despair, inside that hall, the women discovered a sanctuary, not of walls or fences, but of care, kindness, and shared humanity. In their later years, when they told the story to children, grandchildren, or strangers, they would always emphasize the same detail. It was not the food itself that mattered, but the way it was given. Each meal had been a gift, an affirmation that their lives, their spirits, their dignity still mattered. And the memory of that day, that single extraordinary lunch, would remain a symbol of hope, mercy, and the enduring power of compassion. Even when decades passed, the image returned unbidden. The long tables, the glint of sunlight on polished metal trays, the quiet smiles exchanged across the hall. They remembered the hum of conversation, the aroma of warm bread and roasted chicken, the tender attention of the cooks. And in that recollection, they could once again feel what they had felt in that extraordinary moment, that though they had been prisoners, they had been seen, acknowledged, and valued in a way that transcended war, borders, and circumstance. The lesson was indelible. History is often measured in battles won and lost, treaties signed, and nations rebuilt. But sometimes, it is written in the quiet generosity of a meal, in the acknowledgement of another's humanity, and in the courage to treat prisoners not as enemies, but as human beings. For these Italian women, that lunch had rewritten history in their own lives, a single event that outshone years of conflict, suffering, and uncertainty. It was a memory of mercy, a testament to dignity, and an enduring reminder that even in the darkest times, humanity could prevail.